Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle. Welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. My name is Mark Bernier. I'm the moderator for tonight's event. When the Chicago-based Miami Corporation announced last week that 8,500 new homes would be built in the Edgewater area, the first thought that many people had was, where will the water come from? What about stormwater runoff? What will the roads look like? Combine that with the 12,000 additional homes to be built in the Daytona Beach area, it means lots of growth, but how do we sustain it? Tonight, a panel of three will discuss the sustainability of future growth in an expansion era. We have two stars from engineering joining us tonight, and I'll introduce them to you, and a third star who joins us from our friends over at Stetson University. Dr. Jeff Brown is a professor of civil engineering. He is joined by Dr. Taylor Mitchell, assistant professor of composition and humanities, and Clay Henderson, who is from Stetson University. He's the executive director of his own series, the Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience. They join us tonight for discussion on sustainability. Welcome our guests to Embry-Riddle. Thank you for giving up your evening to be with us tonight. I want to begin with first Jeff and Taylor to talk about the coursework that is done here at Embry-Riddle in engineering, in civil engineering, that deals with sustainability. What are you trying to get across to the students?
Well, first, thanks very much, Mark, for hosting this important discussion. I think here at Embry-Riddle, we approach sustainability in a lot of our courses. We do it in, I guess, some slightly different ways. From an engineering perspective, we have a mechanical engineering course that does sustainable design that really tries to incorporate sustainability into design as basic design principles in the engineering process. From a civil engineering perspective, which is where I teach, I think sustainability is kind of built into everything that we try to look at when it comes to basic infrastructure systems for at the municipal level, regional level. But then also Dr. Mitchell and I, and as well as Dr. Anka Arnaud, we teach a course in the honors program that's dedicated to the ethics of sustainability. And so what we try to do in that course is ask some bigger questions about why is sustainability important, and how do we get there from an ethical perspective as opposed to just a purely technical perspective.
You know, the first thing I think of, Dr. Mitchell, when you talk about the ethics involved in this is, are the developers and the people building and designing being honest? Like, okay, we build all this stuff, but once we're gone, how do we take care of the people and the buildings that are built? What goes into the ethics of sustainability?
Beyond that very basic question about whether or not people are lying, which is a good one to ask, what we try to do, I think, is teach our students about the ethical principles and making sure that once the engineers graduate and leave Embry-Riddle, they're going to go on and ask the really hard questions. Beyond, am I lying or not, is this actual company or this project, is it going to be good for my community? Is it going to actually sustain the people? And will it, of course, bring in some sort of profit for my company? Because I do think that's part of working for an engineering company. But we want to build the whole kind of person, asking those very good and hard questions about ethics.
You know, for both of you, as a follow-up, beginning with you, Dr. Mitchell, do students approach this and say, I didn't know we got to know this. I didn't know we need to ask these questions. Does that come up?
That comes up a lot. In fact, you get a lot of pushback from the students when you're asking them to make these hard decisions. Our students at Embry-Riddle are so smart. You can hand them the most complicated physics and engineering problems, these math problems that take up pages, it's letters and numbers, I don't understand it. And they do such an amazing job, but when you step back and ask them to think critically about why they're doing what they're doing, that's where you get a little bit of a pushback. And the honors students are the ones where I think teaching them about the ethics of sustainability is a perfect population to do so, because they want to do that hard work of critical thinking. And I think it makes a lot of sense for them. Once you teach them about ethics, they all come away and they're like, oh, I'm utilitarianism. And like, they're very proud of having these new labels and this new vocabulary to function within. But once again, getting them past that, just solving the problem and asking the difficult questions.
Clay Henderson, you as a practicing attorney also served in this county as a member of the county council. You've been very close to the League of Cities and several organizations throughout your distinguished career. And now you've created a marvelous series at Stetson. How did you become so synonymous with water? Because I know you grew up here.
Well, I grew up on the water. I guess maybe we start with that. And like so many people here, it started with the river or the St. Johns River or the beach, but it's one of the things that defines this county. You know, we're the Atlantic Ocean and Indian River, Halifax River on the east and the St. Johns River on the west. How could you not fall in love with water in this community?
You know, I was reading today under sustainability, I didn't realize this, that, and we're going to get into this, sort of jumping right in, septic tanks are actually contributing to the problem that we're having with the algae bloom, which I didn't know, because I thought that if they were properly contained, even with leaching, it wouldn't contribute. But how is that happening? This is
one of those ticking time bomb issues, and now that bomb has gone off, and it's very interesting watching all the, you know, I guess we're here tonight, we're away from the TV, so we're not watching political ads right now, but they're all about, you know, who's responsible for the algae bloom and some of the water issues that we're facing. And it's symptomatic of where Florida's been for most of our lives, which is we've really grown on the cheap. We've done it the cheap way. And septic tanks are an example of that. So we have probably about 3 million in the state. We have 100,000 septic tanks in this county. I'm always saying everybody wants to be number one in something, and why Volusia County wants to be number one in septic tanks is beyond me. But we see it in all of our springs, the algae. We can actually trace the nutrients in the springs back to the septic tanks. We see it in the Indian River Lagoon, which has been just such a magical, wonderful waterway that's now soiled by this from one end to the other. About 250,000 septic tanks along the Indian River Lagoon system. And then what you're seeing in South Florida right now is a combination of things of which septic tanks are just a part. But we're now having to deal with this, and we're gonna have to pay the bill at some point if we want to have clean water again.
The other thing that our viewers and listeners hear about is red tide. Is that also tied to development?
Well, it's primarily a Gulf issue. I'm trying to think. I can only think of one instance in my life where we've experienced it here in a fairly minor way. On the Gulf right now, this is the biggest outbreak that they've had probably in 20 years. It's the expanse of it all the way from down around Port Charlotte, or maybe even Fort Myers, now past Tampa Bay, and it's been going on for about 10 months. So there's not, I must say truthfully, there's not a lot of data on the exact causes, since it is a natural condition. But the science appears to support the idea that the nutrients in the system, which is mostly from wastewater septic tanks, is causing it to continue and to exacerbate.
Before I work my way back, what is more of an immediate concern? Stormwater runoff or available and potable water?
In the short and long term, the availability of potable water is going to be a necessary and definable aspect for everyone in Central Florida and actually along the peninsula. But you have to look at it holistically. You can't just say potable water versus wastewater versus septic tanks versus stormwater. God's not making any more fresh water, okay? It's the same fresh water, and we have to manage it in a way so that it's sustainable.
Is that ties into water restrictions, things like that?
It's part of it. It's part of it. I think we do a fairly good job of water conservation in this county. I would say, and I'm sure we're going to talk about development, new development is required to do a number of these things to reduce the per capita use of water. We average about 100 gallons a day per person in this county, but down the road on I-4 in Orange County, it's about 500 gallons per capita.
Really?
So we really have to have a common understanding of how we're conserving and what we're doing, and maybe we need to kind of get a little competition going between the counties and the cities. We got problems with the cities too. So.
Are the people in West Volusia holding all the gold because most of the water comes from there?
Yeah, it's good news, bad news. The aquifer that is recharged that we use here at East Volusia, only happens because the rain falls in West Volusia. And so the Floridan aquifer, the upper Floridan, where we receive almost all of our freshwater resources here, it's dependent upon good stewardship in West Volusia. And we got to fix that too.
Dr. Brown, the other day when we were conferencing before, you mentioned something about, I think, is it Tiger Bay, where there's an area there, and if it dips below a certain level?
Right, so that kind of ties into a much broader, really it's a regulatory framework that the state of Florida has adopted related to minimum water levels across the state. There's a very complex section in the, I think it's Florida Administrative Code, that says if the flow rate in Blue Spring drops below such a number, I don't remember what the number is.
142 cubic feet per second.
Okay, I'm glad he's here. That's going to trigger something, right? That means that either we're withdrawing too much water from the aquifer. It can also be caused by drought, and so there are some provisions for natural effects that have to be accounted for. But it's supposed to trigger something, and then the next person that comes along and applies for a consumptive use permit from the Water Management District, they then have a legitimate reason to say, whatever threshold we established here for this particular water body, it's not being met.
Doesn't the state of Florida have a Growth Management Act that was supposed to set the guidelines for how much you could develop? Did they relax it, walk away from it, ignore it?
No. 1985 and 86 legislature passed the Growth Management Act. It was a central feature for all local government until 2010. Every local government was required to pass a comp plan and land development regulations consistent with that. And the big issue was something called concurrency, where you couldn't actually expand growth until you could pay for the infrastructure required to support that. But we had this great recession about 10 years ago, and that's how the state of Florida discovered how dependent it was on the growth machine for the economy. And so the Department of Community Affairs, which oversaw that, was abolished. Growth Management Act was effectively repealed and replaced with a different system, and that's what we have today. And miraculously, we're back to growing at a rate of about 1,000 people a day.
Wow. How many people in our audience think traffic is a problem? Yeah, there we go. Dr. Brown, Dr. Mitchell, I thought they were supposed to measure traffic count when they come out with plans to develop either shopping malls or additional businesses on streets. Anybody been on Grenada Boulevard lately? Yeah. Does that not fall into concurrency?
Well, from a civil engineering perspective, I know that the traffic impact study is a major component of every new development. And this is where I think it gets into some really interesting questions about concurrency. If you're proposing a new development or a new project, and for whatever reason you again trip a threshold, and now you need a new traffic signal on Grenada Boulevard, well, who's responsible for paying that? If it's stuck on the developer's tab, then that can be challenging for them. But if it's not kept up through the city, what can you do?
Now, go ahead.
Sorry. But what happens too when we don't plan for this exponential growth? When you have a bridge that's only 2 lanes, or Grenada Boulevard, where you cannot expand it unless we then knock down, and there's got to be costs associated with that. So beyond who's paying for this, it's like no one thought about these things, particularly going from beachside across. I mean, we have bridges in New Smyrna Beach where I live, and we're not expanding them. It's 2 lanes, and all of the tourists coming over, there's traffic, and I can't get home.
Well, and
2 bridges.
To even closer, LPGA, where 10,000 homes will go up. The bridge that crosses 95 is still going to be 2 lanes. And the city doesn't want in, the county doesn't want in, the state doesn't want in, the feds don't want in. There is a rumor that it could take 15 years to settle that. Does that sound right to you, Clay, that it could take that long?
Well, it could take, I don't know about that aspect of it, but right now it's about funding. So we don't have a surplus of transportation-related improvement funding in this county. It's all tied to the gas tax, and haven't received a whole lot from the state in the last few years. So, but it's another complicated formula, almost like concurrency.
Yeah, I don't want to drag them into this, but I got to ask, at least touch on it. We will not solve all the problems tonight or answer all the questions, but we're going to cover many things. And I'm going to come to our front row folks in just a moment. Impact fees.
Yep.
It's controversial because the county council here, just for anybody who didn't know, decided not to raise the impact fees, but at the same time, that was when they decided not to raise the sales tax. There have been some studies done that say that it's inevitable, it has to happen, right, for growth to pay for itself?
Well, growth doesn't pay for itself unless you add that to it, unless you do create an impact fee. You're not going to, the ad valorums do not really raise enough dollars to take care of that cost of infrastructure. We had an impact fee, in this county we have impact fees over a wide range of issues. Before the recession, there was a significant menu of impact fees. They were updated on the basis of the economy and cost of building and the cost of infrastructure. Again, after the recession, most of the local governments cut them or abolished them or issued a moratorium on them. Now we're back to growing at the pre-recession rates again, but the impact fees on the whole have not caught up to the numbers required to pay for that infrastructure required to support that new growth.
I want to do a sidebar because in our audience is Dwight Selby. He's a member of the Ormond Beach City Commission, and I wanted to have you speak to the Grenada Point project, that this is more of infill, even though there was controversy about the trees, and this does not exceed concurrency as you explained it to me. Could you explain to our audience?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Well, the Grenada Point project is the one that is under construction right now on Grenada West, between Orchard and Nova Road. And that project received minimal, basically very little negative comment in all of its development approvals and so forth. I think what you'll see is a very attractive project once it's done, with a lot of landscaping, a lot of new trees, and tons of other plants and landscaping and so forth that'll make it really beautiful.
And there's supposed to be a minimal additional traffic, is that as I understand it,
well,
from this?
Yeah, I mean, all commercial growth, commercial always follows residential. So if you approve the subdivision, you add residents, and when you add residents, then the commercial services follow that. No, a grocery store doesn't get built, out on a county road somewhere. It gets built when there's 10,000, well, Publix uses 10,000 residents within a couple of miles. So, so generally speaking, the type of most of the businesses that will probably end up in a Grenada Point are, you're already traveling on Grenada, and then you stop in and avail yourself to those businesses. So they don't really generate trips themselves. They're just accommodating passengers or traffic that's already going by those locations.
Thank you, Dwight. Also joining us is the former mayor of the city, also in Ormond Beach, also served in the state legislature, Fred Costello. During the time that you were on the commission and as the mayor of the city, did you see similar concerns about growth patterns? Because I know that you talked about championing a project that is in the north part of the city, right on the Flagler line. Can you speak to this?
Thank you for hosting this. I think this is good for everybody. As far as the first part of your question, I want to talk about Hand Avenue, which some of us have talked about as the only way to relieve Grenada. And years ago, some of the anti-growth folks convinced the Metropolitan Planning Organization to take that off the future planning, because they were afraid that would stimulate growth. And what Commissioner Selby just said is 100% right. There are certain things that generate new trips other things that don't generate trips. And it's hard for the public to understand the difference when they see a development come in. They think that itself is going to add traffic. Sometimes it does not add traffic. It captures the traffic that's already going by. Ormond Crossings, the project you talked about at the north area of Ormond Beach, the reason that was so important to me as mayor at that time was that was the only way we could grow in a way that would create the high-wage jobs. So we wanted to stimulate a certain type of growth, and that's what I think local government tries to do when we have that option, but we have to yield to the landowner. They have the choice of what they're going to put in as long as it goes with the code. So what the community wants has to be tempered with what the landowner feels they can make the money to buy. If the zoning is there, we can't tell them no.
Thank you, Fred. I want to come back to Taylor and ask, when a development is being planned, just as we opened, we talked about the Edgewater situation. Is civil engineering, is it ethically bound to allow for expansion or only for what is put in front of them when it's talking about design? Do you have to allow for example, there's going to be 3 different land situations. We discussed this a couple of days ago in Edgewater. Do you have to allow for the outskirts, or do you only have to concern yourself with what would be built?
Well, I would like to assume that the project planners are concerning themselves with the outskirts as well as their focus on the actual community. So I think going back to our class and what we try to teach our students is making sure that they're asking the hard questions about how this is going to function within the community. So when you think about things like corporate social responsibility, right, or the triple bottom line that has expanded this model of growth from a profit model to include the people and the planet. I would like to hope that the planners are doing that as well. And we have lots of models that we can look to for sustainable development. The Babcock Ranch it's on the west coast, right? These are planners that set aside, it's 90% of the land, they set it aside for green space. And they focused just on the acreage that they knew they would want to build on. And within those plans, they added in space for commercial development as well. So they all kind of coincided. This very particular ranch had the room to do this, right? It's very different than building something in Grenada where there's already homes and already businesses. But we do have models for sustainable planning. And I'm fascinated why we don't already use those models that have existed.
What about height, building heights? I want to touch upon this. I don't know if that's a quality of life issue or an engineering issue, because if you have high buildings and you have fires, how do you take care of them? Jeff, does that enter into the civil engineering design, how high buildings can be?
Well, it does on a couple of different levels, also related to the planning issue. I like to go down to Ponce Inlet every now and then and do a little bit of surfing down there. But as you're looking north, you can see in the Wilbur by the Sea area and how limited or restricted the height of all their condominiums are. And then you get to the Daytona Beach area, and things just kind of shoot up.
Yeah.
Many
We have
more
some
stories.
people from the shores in the audience tonight
Right.
where I think they lifted the height, right? So now they can go, depending on the footprint, they could go to 26 or 30 stories.
I mean, I can tell you from a civil structural engineering standpoint, 27 stories is a drop in the bucket. I mean, you look at a city like Chicago, you've got 87 up to 100 stories.
But we're on sand, Jeff. Does that work?
I think we can engineer a way around that. I don't think that's going to be. In Chicago, they're doing it on like a clay, kind of a clay silty soil. So it's definitely doable.
But one of the things that we can think of is how tall your building is going to be. It's going to cast that size shadow. And so when we're thinking about sustainability and sustainability design, those people now will no longer be able to grow their garden, right? And so this gets into very particular things and very personal things about not in my backyard, right? So the higher you go, it's going to change the landscape of the community.
And it casts a shadow on the beach.
There you go, Clay. He opened the door.
I was not necessarily advocating for 87-story tall condominiums. I would be fascinated from a structural engineering standpoint, but from a community perspective, I don't think I don't think it's where we want to go.
Here's a long-standing question that comes. If someone buys land on the east side of A1A, say, and they're in, say, Daytona Beach or Daytona Beach Shores, and for years they've been able to look straight across the street and see the ocean, but suddenly someone was able to put a building up and it's 20 stories tall. Clay, from an ethical standpoint, I mean, do they have any say? I'm thinking unless they own the land, how do they stop somebody from building on it?
Well, they can't in that context. But as has been said, we have different height limits in every one of the coastal communities in this county. We went through the exercise many years ago in New Smyrna after that one big project went in on the north end, and made a decision in terms of overall community values, balancing these interests, the issue of view, the issue of shadows on the beach, and then also just the infrastructure to be able to service this, and came to an agreement on what we thought would be best for our community. The Shores has answered that question in a different way, the county and each of the cities. So it's something that every city can do as long as it's supported by the infrastructure and by good planning principles.
Okay, I'm going to come back to rising waters because the News Journal did a great piece. Did many of you read the piece the News Journal did? I thought it was very effective. It really shed a light on an issue that is controversial but is real. But first, Heidi Herzberg is the vice mayor of Deltona. Water has been an important issue to her and her colleagues as well. I wanted to ask you to speak about the water supply, stormwater runoff, of these issues that Deltona faces.
Thank you, Mark. Well, first of all, Deltona is Volusia County's largest city, a population about 90,000. We have about 35,000 homes. Most all are single family, and most of those are on quarter-acre lots. And when Deltona was developed, we had 3 different areas that the Mackle brothers developed, and all those had infrastructure. They had sanitary sewer, they had gas, and they also had city water, street lights, and sidewalks in the 60s and early 70s. And after the Mackle brothers sold that area out, they left. And then we had probably 20 years of just growth under the county before we became an incorporated city in 1994. And so you're looking at basically, we're about 23, 24 years incorporated. And when you look at that, when you look through the 10-year fight of incorporation, you look at the growth, and you look at the boom, you look at the bust, the foreclosures, and you look at everything that's needed in the city, the infrastructure is truly lacking there for the residential area and the commercial area. The infrastructure that was originally put in for water and so forth and stormwater is old. And so what we had to do is we had to go ahead and we did a stormwater fund, and everybody that owns a piece of property out there pays. And we've really come very, very far with our stormwater. We have worked with St. John's for our cup. We have worked on putting in rib ponds, rapid infiltration basins in 123 acres. We took half of that we had in the middle of the city. And what we're doing there is working on taking the stormwater, shooting it up there, and we're going to be treating that into becoming reclaimed or reuse, because the one thing that Deltona lacks in, when you have those 3 pockets where it was originally constructed, and I said they put sanitary sewer in there, there's only under 6,000 homes that have sewer, which leaves about 26,000 septic tanks. And so when
That's a big issue in Deltona.
It's a big issue, but when you look at the 6,000 people that are on sanitary sewer, those are the people that were originally producing all the reuse. And our ordinances state that every new subdivision that goes in has to have reuse lines. So consequently, we've had at least 5 to 6 subdivisions that have had dry lines. The one Saxon Ridge right on I-4 and Saxon Boulevard, it's been 17 years that they've had dry lines, because the cost to connect from the old area, the Deltona Boulevard area, to Saxon Ridge, just to connect the reuse, it's over $500,000 to $1 million. And fortunately now we've budgeted for that, because we actually have an overabundance. We have reuse now that we can start giving these subdivisions that. So it's a cycle, and like everyone else has talked about, everything is intertwined. Okay. One thing leads to another, and you have to plan for the future. Okay,
I want to come back and hand it to Dwight. Dwight, on a radio broadcast, you said to me, And you educated me as to how the septic tank issue can even affect Ormond Beach because of elevation, I believe you said. If these leak, they could eventually leak into the Halifax River?
Yes, absolutely.
Are we on?
Hello?
There
There
you
we go. So the groundwater on the peninsula flows from the ocean to the intercoastal waterway. And the average elevation of A1A is about 15 feet above sea level, and John Anderson Drive is about 5 feet above sea level. So all of the outflow from septic tanks ends up moving with the groundwater into the intercoastal waterway.
Okay. Pat Northey, you were not only on the county council, but you were a member of the MPO, the TPO, I think.
Correct.
And there may be others that I've left you out, part of our Volusionaries family. Pat, is stormwater runoff a big issue in Deltona?
Yeah, it is an issue, and the city, to their credit, has been trying to address that. But one of the things about Deltona that really helps to handle stormwater runoff is the homes were designed with swale, with a swale that goes deep, and that really does
Supposed to catch the water between properties?
And it really does. That really works, and so you see that throughout all of the city. So that does go down and infiltrate into the ground, and so that's a good thing. But anytime you start development, and particularly we have a lot of lakes in Deltona, they were losing water and it wasn't being replenished. Now, and Heidi, I'm not sure whether the dam got opened up in Lake Helen or whether it's just all the rain, but the lakes are coming back in Deltona. They were in very bad shape because of all of the hard surface that we were putting in. So yeah, but the swale system in Deltona does work for the individual homeowner.
Okay. Sinkholes. From an engineering standpoint, you can't possibly anticipate everything, but does civil engineering have to open to the prospect of sinkholes as a result of what's being built and where the water table is? Do you advise, do civil engineers advise clients that you could have this problem if you do this?
Yeah, that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I know that geotechnical engineers are very involved in the whole sinkhole process. I'm fairly certain, though, that predicting when and where a sinkhole is actually going to open up, I don't know of many engineers who make that claim on a regular basis.
Taylor, any additional viewpoint on that?
No, except for I know that as an individual homeowner, watching families try to sell their homes after a sinkhole, and I don't know what regulatory practices we can put into place to protect the homeowner from sinkholes that no one is expecting to happen.
When the story came out last week about one on Stetson University's campus,
right.
I immediately thought of you. Is it near his office?
No, it's next to the president's mansion.
Oh,
So I'm convinced it's going to get a lot of attention, and they're going to work on it. I think the answer, these things can open up anywhere in this karst environment, which is predominantly in West Volusia. You're not going to see a sinkhole open here under the Embry-Riddle campus. But it can happen anywhere. And what's interesting is that we often see sinkholes when we're in a drought, because the aquifer levels have gone down and the lake levels have gone down and the structural integrity, it changes. But you also see an uptick in sinkholes when we're in a wet time. And right now we're in a very wet time. We've already had a year's worth of rainfall, and it's still September. We've had the one at Stetson. We've had the one open up in DeBerry. And again, it's not unusual. Because the structure changes when it's both very wet and very dry.
You and I connected as a result of the stories the News Journal did about rising waters. Each year I go to Miami-Dade College for the annual book fair. It's a marvelous event. I recommend it to anybody. But not too far from campus, the water's coming up. Yep. And they've been marking it each year to the point where on-ramps and off-ramps are actually having walls go up on the side. That's how much they're worried about this. This isn't a retaining pond that's come over. It's actually ocean water. Clay, your experience in looking at this, we have rising water. What's the reason for it? And it seems to be largely in southeast Volusia, right?
Well, it's a southeastern coast all the way up to Chesapeake. And we should all go take a look at the Halifax River or the Indian River in the next couple of days, because we're now entering the king tide season. So around the full moons of September, October, and November, what we've been seeing all up and down the Southeast American coast are these king tides. Sunny day events, may not be any wind, there might be a breath of fresh air, not a cloud in the sky, and all of a sudden the water is lapping over the sinkhole, or over the seawall. The seawall in front of my house in New Smyrna was built in 1902. Up until the last few years, the only time that water's been above it was during a named tropical event. Now it's fairly regularly in the fall that you're going to have these king tide events. And then that exacerbates all the other issues that you have to deal with. So when we had this time a year ago, we were dealing with Irma. Irma produced the highest water levels that we've seen on the East Coast in this county, in anybody's memory. The river came 200 feet out of the banks in front of my house, which is, I would have never guessed that would be possible. So we're seeing this all up and down the coast. It's been the worst in South Florida. Miami-Dade has just passed a fairly large bond issue to produce about $500 million to do a lot of infrastructure needs. They're talking about elevating roads, they're talking about pumping it out, but when you talk about pumping the water out, it's sort of like building the sandcastle on the rising tide. This is causing everyone to look at these issues anew. The Keys, where some of our faculty are doing some work right now, you're dealing with a situation where you know that time is not on your side. So we're all going to have to be smarter about this. Both New Smyrna, for instance, as a result of this interest in the issue after Irma, has been having a year-long series on resiliency. Hundreds of residents have been engaged and involved in this process. One of the things that we've sort of all learned is that we think about these big first impacts being on the ocean. Know that the first impacts are more inland, where water builds up, floodwaters build up, and they can't get out. And so a lot of new focus has got to be on understanding where we're going to flood and what are we going to do about it.
The city of Daytona Beach has a basin. Once the city is established to the degree it is, you really can't do much about it, right, Clay?
Well, that's more of an engineering question. You
Okay,
I'll pivot on that one, but yeah, there's things you can do.
Out of curiosity, can it be engineered away? It's probably expensive.
I think it's a question of cost and how much you're willing to invest. Anytime you start actually talking about raising elevation on existing properties, that's really not an option. It's more of a question of what are you going to do. If it's a major redevelopment project, something along those lines, I think you have an opportunity to build that in, and I would hope that we are looking at that a little bit more closely. But I know the area you're talking of, down along Beach Street.
Yeah.
I would have a hard time envisioning a pumping scenario that would take care
Like
of
a lift station type of thing? Wow.
I don't know where you'd spray it.
Okay. Beach renourishment. Does that come into consideration if you're building or engineering on the beach?
Actually, there's a whole field of coastal engineering that's dedicated solely to that.
Do they do it?
Issue.
Whether they say, I got this land, I can build to 18 stories, I'm building to 18 stories and not worry about it.
And not worry. Well, I think with the coastal erosion process, I think we're actually pretty lucky here in Volusia County when it comes to that issue compared to down in Cocoa and up in St. Augustine. So it's really very site dependent. I think people who are investing in these large infrastructure projects are going to definitely be taking it more seriously now that the levels are rising.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered
Pat
that
Northey, I
question.
want to come back to you because you were one of the first to speak out and say it's not worth it, and I think it had to do with the amount of money every year to put the sand for beach renourishment. We need to come up with a better way. Refresh our memories as to what that discussion was.
2007, the county council, Andy Kelly and I I was elected, and Andy Kelly was elected. And we kind of led the charge to not do beach renourishment projects on Volusia County beaches. It was just sand that you pumped out on the beach, and the next tide came in and rolled a lot of it out. And so I don't know whether that's changed, Mark, because every decision, sometimes, not every decision, but many decisions get revisited. But the 8 years I spent from 2007 on, we did not do beach renourishment projects in Volusia County. And it was a decision that was made by the council because it was expensive, and it didn't do, in the long run, it didn't do any good.
Clay, how do we do beach renourishment now? Are we still doing it with sand, or are we doing something else?
That's the method that's used around the state is sand, sand transport. We're spending about $50 million a year on state funds subsidizing these projects, plus there's Corps of Engineers dollars. That's like matching against federal stuff. But there's no, I'm thinking out loud, so I don't think of any part of the state now, every part has been subject to some form of beach renourishment, depending upon when the last hurricane hit and what the local officials, feel that erosion has had and to be replaced. I do agree that, all these beaches are dynamic processes. I do think on the whole, we're in a much better shape. You've watched the beaches come back, significantly since the 2004 event, which did take a real whack out of our beaches.
Staying with the rising waters for a moment, can you inform us, is there discussion at any level that you know of about talking about having planning to dealing with these rising waters on this coastal situation as it applies to development?
Well, the discussions have all been local. This is not an issue that we've seen much discussion or leadership at the state level for the last few years, and I'll just leave it at that. But what the legislature did do was authorize local governments to do what they call an adaptation action area, and that is to take their comp plans and plan for the rising seas. Now, South Florida has done a really good job with this. The 4 South Florida counties, Monroe, Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, have come together. They formed the Southeast Florida Compact. They have reached agreement on the amount of sea level rise that they expect over the next 50 years. And you're required to plan to those levels when you're dealing with infrastructure, when you're dealing with new development. And there are local communities north of there that have done the same thing. Martin County has now adopted an adaptation action area, and there's some local communities such as Satellite Beach in Brevard County that have done that. There's no community in Volusia County has taken that up to my knowledge, but it would be a smart thing to do.
How often does this happen that you've seen this, where roads are constructed and then suddenly, within about a year and a half, they're breaking? You see potholes, and then they have to be resurfaced. From an engineering standpoint, this may have to do a lot, not only with traffic, but weight. I know some people have had to resurface private roads because delivery vehicles are so heavy. Do they take this into consideration, engineers, in terms of the weight, the impact of vehicles that could be in a planned development?
Yeah, I think there's a whole, asphalt and pavement design process that has to be, different roads are going to have different requirements at the city and county level based on what the projected use is. I know there's been discussion about, more delivery vehicles in residential areas. I think it's another one of those dynamic situations that maybe we didn't envision 20, 25 years ago when those roads were originally designed.
In our discussion the other day, I think we talked about a study Embry-Riddle is doing on some sort of new housing or small housing.
Tiny houses.
Oh, right.
Could you speak to this and share with our audience?
It's part of Jeff's senior design class. So one of the students is looking into creating a community of tiny houses.
A community of 10 houses.
Tiny
houses?
Tiny houses.
Like how tiny?
Oh, I think they're on the order of 400 square feet or less. Right.
Wow.
Right.
So this
It's a
would
new
be
trend. There's
It
even
is
a
a new
show.
trend,
There's
yeah.
even a show, tiny houses.
wow. Is this following a European model of any kind? Because I know the Europeans were working on this as long ago as 10 years ago.
Right. I think there's definitely a smaller footprint for most things in European communities. But the idea for this tiny house, there's actually been a couple of initiatives here on Embry-Riddle's campus. We had the solar decathlon project that took place a year or so ago, where we actually built a house that was essentially a net zero house that they built over here on a piece of Embry-Riddle property and shipped it all the way to Colorado to compete in this competition to demonstrate some of the efficiencies that they can build into houses these days. That technically wasn't a tiny house, and they still shipped it all the way to Colorado. So that was an interesting experience. But what the students are looking at now is, as opposed to just the structure and the architecture of the tiny houses, it's how do you plan a community of these houses and make it work from a sustainability perspective? Can you provide all of the energy that you need through solar panels if you can reduce the footprint of the house and the volume of space that you're trying to cool in the heat of the summer? There's all sorts of issues that they can look at from a community perspective that hopefully can get built into this. But then it comes up against zoning issues. You mentioned in Deltona, somebody mentioned 80-foot, quarter acre lots. I doubt that there's a community that would actually, or a city that would actually permit this proposed development under current zoning regulations. So that's another issue that would have to be looked at. But I think that's one of the things that really gets students to think about these longer term issues.
Do you think that developers will be pushed toward building smaller houses in the future? This is just opinion.
No.
You say no.
I think it's a consumer question. I think the cost for cooling homes, cost for building homes is relatively stable. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of pressure to move towards a smaller home. And I've got a family of 4. I don't see a tiny house in our future.
What about we are low flush toilets, less impact shower. Clay, does this have to be mandated for it to stick? Because when you give people the option, they'll say low flow, not for me.
Well, we get a lot of rainfall here, but out west with, less than 20 inches of rain per year, it is mandated in a number of places. And it would have been mandated for new development, and yet the state, like maybe I think Colorado's an example, where they've actually gone back and now subsidizing people in older homes. Sell us your toilet, and we'll give you a new low-flow toilet, because water is such a precious commodity there, and so we're certainly going to see more of that.
Jeff?
Yeah, just an interesting comment related to Colorado. So when we were building this solar decathlon home here on campus, students were all huddled around trying to think of different sustainable features that they could add to this net zero sustainable house. And one of the things that came up immediately was rainwater collection. So we have to have a rainwater collection system on this house in order to enhance the sustainability. Well, unfortunately, the competition was being held in Colorado. There is no such thing as rainwater collection in the state of Colorado. You are prohibited you cannot collect rain from that falls on your roof, because it's all part of a very complex allocation system. Somebody downstream already owns that water that's falling on your roof.
We were talking about that in class tonight, by the way.
Yeah.
So the happiest people, by the way, are my students who got out early so that I could come over here tonight. But this is what we were talking about tonight. Yeah. You don't own the water in the West.
Wow.
Yeah.
What about the lawsuit between Florida and Georgia? Will that ever be settled?
Well, the Supreme Court has punted again, but they've laid down a principle that has been a legal principle in the East since the early 19th century, which is that in the East you have the right to use this water in a reasonable and beneficial use, so long as you do not harm the downstream owners. we're the downstream owners. And so it doesn't matter how well we have been conserving water in Florida if in Atlanta they are not, and in the agricultural areas of South Georgia, they're taking the rest of that water. So the court has reestablished this equitable principle, sent it back for more testimony, and yeah, we may, for people like me, this is far more exciting than a Florida versus Georgia football game. Okay?
There you go. We're going to take questions from the audience. Our students, general public, if you'd like to make a comment, we have 2 microphones set. I'd like you to come down right now so that we can get you on record. While I wait for our first voice, let me ask, we didn't touch on wildlife. And the concurrency and the planning, when you impact wildlife, it sounds like the state is sensitive to it. I want to start with Clay, but are they sensitive to the impact on wildlife? And I say this because we built a home in Ormond Lakes, and now we see animals everywhere that we didn't see before, and it sounds like it's because, or it feels like it's because they got pushed out of other areas. Clay?
Well, that's true, but let me bring it back to water. I wanted to do that. So, we're now seeing extraordinary mortality events for manatees, for dolphins on both coasts, for fish. I recently heard something I've never even thought of before. It was a dolphin coming to the surface and coughing. Okay, this is what we're doing to our marine environment, and that is having an effect on wildlife in ways that we've not seen before. And yes, as we move, it's like the bear issue in Florida. As we move more and more into bear habitat, we're going to see more conflict with bears, and that's going to be true for the rest of wildlife as well.
Is that why the hunting season comes and goes? The population gets too steep, and then they almost wipe out a whole species? Wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a poor political decision and a poor wildlife management decision, and proved to be extremely unpopular. So we've not had bear hunting in this state for more than 20 years. They allowed it for 1 year. It was a public relations nightmare, and more bears were killed than they had planned, and it'll be a while before we're going to talk about it. Anybody's going to talk about that again.
Okay. We'll take questions. Anybody want to come up to the microphone? I'll continue. Doctor, you're first. Go ahead.
I'm JT Shim, leadership coach. I have tons of questions, but I'll start with one. I have a young lady who wants to affect water. She wants to be a senator. Then she decided she would have more impact as a judge. First recommendation is she watched the movie Erin Brockovich, which she hasn't watched yet. What other advice would you tell me to give her other than to contact you?
Oh, wow. Well, one of the things that our students learned in class tonight, and why shouldn't y'all as well, is that out west they actually have water courts. So maybe the student might want to move to Colorado and be a water judge, for instance, and adjudicate rights. But I think that the issue of water gets handled as a policy level at every level. Congress certainly has a lot to say about water, EPA, the Corps of Engineers, the state level, there are a number of agencies and elected officials that deal with that. Plus we have water management districts, or one of the few states that have regional water management districts that are based upon the hydrological boundaries rather than the political boundaries. And then we have a lot of people here that have served in local government. They own that's where the water meets the road, or where the rubber meets the road. They're responsible for delivering that water to a customer. They're also responsible for dealing with wastewater and stormwater. So, if you learn about this subject, there's plenty of opportunities for leadership and a policy position at every level of government. Tell her it's a good choice.
Does St. John's River water management exist in different forms throughout the state, throughout the country? Water management districts, the people who are on it are selected by the governor, but they manage and they dictate mitigation, am I correct?
Among other things.
Among many, are they effective, in your opinion?
Well, when there's a political system, there's always some cyclical aspects to it. In this state, we have 5 water management districts. We're in St. John's. Their board members are appointed by the governor. I must say every governor in my adult lifetimes had a different approach to who they appointed and how they corresponded. Some gave them a very much hands-off. I've appointed you to go use your independent judgment. We've had other governors that have faxed them their instructions on how to vote while they're sitting at the dais. So it depends. But on the whole, it's given us an ability to look at water holistically. It's to know more about how the resource is acting and how to manage it. But do we need to do more? Absolutely, we need to do more.
Jeff?
Two quick points. I was actually interned with the Water Management District when I was a civil engineering student over at UCF, and I really got to appreciate the work that they do. But I think my important story is a little bit more anecdotal. I'm from the Daytona Beach area. Grew up here. I remember back when I was maybe 10 to 11 years old, we took a sailing class over there by City Island where they have the boathouse there now, and I never will forget this. We had to get our tetanus shot before we took the sailing class, because at that time, I remember if you stepped into the water, into the Halifax River, at that time you were knee deep or higher in a lot of muck. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I went away to college, did some other things, lived up in Michigan for a few years. But when I came back, I think the surface water quality in a lot of areas has improved drastically. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way the Water Management District enforces all of their surface water management policies.
When did they decide how and when to dredge?
You're talking about the intercoastal waterway?
Yes.
Well, the decision on when to dredge was made about 100 years ago. So it's been dredged, but it's required to be maintained all up and down the Atlantic East Coast to a 12-foot depth. And then we have a state agency here called the Florida Inland Navigation District that's responsible for carrying that out at the local level. And those decisions they're engineering decisions, and it's really about maintaining that required 12-foot depth, and those decisions go back to the very earliest times of our republic, because before trains and planes and automobiles, commerce was a ship on that intercoastal waterway.
Looking for anybody who has a question or wants to make a comment. I want to try to get some additional voices. If you'll just come right down. Sharon LaBeouf is with us. Among the things that she's involved in, bluespringsalliance.org, but there's a water discussion coming up, and I wanted to give you a chance to mention it.
I'm also with the Volusia Water Alliance, and we are putting on a symposium, a water symposium, October 26th. We will have speakers, expert speakers on all kinds of water issues. It's a free program. It's at the Sanborn Center in DeLand. It'll be from 9 to 4. And Dr. Jason Evans is our keynote speaker. We'll have a lot of surprises. We have a film that we're showing. We're inviting everyone to come, including candidates, officials that are elected right now. And we want to bring the community. We want to bring the idea that we all need to work together with the water issues now that we've been hearing so much about and we're watching happening in front of us. So I invite you all, and I ask you to ask your neighbors and families and friends. I left some cards over here.
What time and date again is the meeting?
It's October 26th.
At
on a
time?
Friday. It's 9 to 4, and it's at the Sanborn Center in DeLand. It's a beautiful venue. Clay will also be there. We have some wonderful speakers, so please come. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just say this third or fourth year this has happened. We've had some good speakers, and it's everybody learns something, and everybody is about how we can make our water resources better and how we're all involved with it.
I didn't want to get too technical because I wanted to keep the discussion as broad as possible. Do we have a huge threat of saltwater intrusion in Volusia County because of whatever the water table is?
Listen, our geology makes that an issue here. We are an island of fresh water here in Volusia County. As I said, we're surrounded by the Atlantic on the east, the St. John's on the west. We don't think about the St. John's as being salt water, but it has elevated levels of salt water. It's really a relic estuary. And so the groundwater that we use here is all water that falls upon Volusia County and goes right back into our aquifer. We're not taking water from Flagler County or Lake County or Brevard County. It's ours. It's ours to manage. And then what we don't think about is that this is a lens of fresh water that sits on top of old, ancient relic seawater that's even more salty than the ocean. And so if you take out more than you're putting back in, think of it as like your bank account. At some point, it's going to run out. And so it's ours to manage. We have to manage it in a sustainable way. If we run out, we're not going to run out of water. It's just going to cost us a whole lot more. And so we need to do this as best we can.
I'm sure there's people here that are familiar with the Unified Building Code. When did that come out? 2003, 2000? It was to enhance.
No, it was updated in 2003. I think it was mostly on the structural perspective, from the structural engineering perspective, it was mostly a result of Hurricane Andrew,
right,
and a lot of the damage that was
from 92.
From 92.
So having that as the backdrop, do you consider yourselves, when you're working with students, talking about the effects of wind on structures? If you have this many houses, this high building, the wind is going to bounce from here to there. Does that come into it or not?
I teach a whole graduate course on wind engineering.
Really?
Yes, I do.
Do they?
It's part of our master's program in civil engineering.
Is it considered the opinion of learned people such as yourselves that developers take enough of the science of wind movement into consideration when they plan developments? Because that's the thing I worry about. You got all these houses, and it's going to affect how the air flows when they're this close together or they're that far apart. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, I think from a residential house standpoint, the process is relatively well established for wind loading and designing structures to resist those loads. I think things do really start to get more complicated when you're talking about big cities with high-rise buildings. That's when they start to do wind tunnel experiments for every new building that might be proposed. But it's definitely the technical terminology that we use is the boundary layer of the wind as it flows across the surface, and it's certainly interrupted by everything that it encounters and comes into contact with. So it's part of the design process. And so depending on where your structure is located relative to say the airport, which would be considered wide open exposure, versus a wooded area that might have just different wind characteristics based on that ground cover.
Is part of sustainability, when you develop new communities or build a series of homes, you're going to have to allow for not only schools, but parks, things like that? Does that come into consideration? Any kind of requirement?
Sure, no. When you talk about sustainability, I think most of our conversation is about the natural environment, but for a sustainable community, it's got to be beyond that. It has to be really at an intersection of the environmental issues, the economics. If the economics don't work, the sustainability won't work, but also the social issues, because it has to work for everybody. And if it can't just work for one part of society. And so that's the trick, is how you create and make these designs for a sustainable community where everyone benefits.
Is low-income housing part of a sustainability study?
It needs to be.
It needs to be.
But it's not, is it? It comes in after the fact? Or is it granted, if somebody wants to build, yes, but you're going to have to contribute to a bank of properties that are for low income?
I think every municipality will handle that differently, but when you think about the three, we use in our honors class, the environmental, the social, and the economic realms, and we really get our students we try to get our students to think about those three areas, particularly after the UN expanded what it meant by sustainability and sustainability growth to include poverty. I mean, that expansion of it would necessarily make us think about affordable housing, particularly in a state that is seeing such amazing population growth. I mean, and a lot of the people that are coming here, even from Hurricane Matthew, they need a place to live, and so they're coming here, and we need to be able to give them affordable housing, and it's not built into a lot of municipality plans right now, but it needs to be.
When I first approached the three of you to do this, one of the things that I had in the back of my mind was, when we see all the retail that is coming, I'm wondering, can we sustain it? Now, the investors, the banks, they're not going to back something that's going to fail, but is it survival of the fittest? Or is there any type of discussion that enters into this community can sustain all this retail or it can't, because you can't build an economy on retail. You build it on good paying jobs, higher paying jobs. This is a jump ball. Anybody can weigh in on this.
Well, what's the largest value company in the country right now? It's Amazon. And Amazon's not a big box, you know. I mean, so the market is changing, and the other thing that's changing that is a concern here is on the quality of jobs, you know. And you know, when half of the jobs that you're producing are for basically minimum wage or just above that, the need for affordable housing takes on a whole new meaning. So again, you can't have a sustainable community or a state unless you're dealing with all of those segments, of which the social equity is just as important.
Is it generally hard for communities to break out of a service economy to get into a higher paying economy?
I think Florida's a perfect example of that. I mean, you think about us trying to diversify our economy and bring high paying jobs, particularly back to like Titusville, the tech jobs, but we rely on tourism here. And as I used to be in the tourist industry and the service industry. That's where I made a lot of money, asking people how they'd like their steak cooked. But I think that Florida is working towards diversifying, but right now, when you think about our population and what it serves and the people that are coming to our state, we have an older population, and we mainly have service positions, particularly in Orange County, when you think about it. Disney, all of the places, it's for tourists.
Yeah. 1991, August, Clay Henderson in the radio studio says,
oh my,
the number one part of our economy is agriculture, which is what you said. Is it still?
Back to water, I would say that it's still the biggest user of water in Florida, and the country is still agriculture. It is also interesting that the top 3 agricultural counties in Florida are, ready for this, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Hillsborough.
Wow. Okay? Hillsborough, I can believe.
Strawberries and tomatoes.
Yeah.
The biggest is Palm Beach, because that's where all of our sugar comes from. And Miami-Dade is the biggest county in the state, but it also produces so much of the winter vegetables for the Florida and the whole East Coast. So agriculture is less of an economic giant as it was then, and that's been intervening drought, it's been citrus greening, for which they haven't come up with a cure yet. We've lost, I mean, when I was a kid, we had thousands of acres of citrus in this county, and now you would maybe hundreds of acres. Okay, so that's gone through significant change. So I'm going to assume if I said that 25 years ago, it was true, but it's not as true today.
Okay. Any other comments from our front row here? I tried to touch on everybody here, but go ahead, Dwight.
I have a question for Clay regarding that last comment, agriculture being the largest user of water. They use it to irrigate, obviously. Yep. So isn't that, so you draw it out of the aquifer and then it ends up right back in the aquifer?
Well, it depends upon how much fertilizer is going back in the aquifer with it. Okay, and that's a real issue in certain parts of the state.
May I have a follow-up?
Yep.
Okay, the follow-up is when you talked about sea level rise and the compact in South Florida, is sea level, water seeks its own level. I mean, we all learned that a long time ago, right? Okay, so but does it do that globally or maybe in the state? In other words, if they're right in South Florida, and I don't know how much they've adopted that sea level is going to rise per year for the next 40 or 50 years, whatever you said it was. Can we rely on that in Volusia County, or will our rise be different than their rise is?
Yeah, what we've seen is from Key West to the Chesapeake, evidence of this increase. And where we're really seeing it is with these king tides. Now in Florida, in terms of statistics, the best statistics come from the United States Navy, which has had a base in Key West since the 19th century and a position at Mayport, at the mouth of the St. Johns River for, maybe 100 years, I'm not sure. But they've got data that is over 100 years old. So you can see where the sea level was at the turn of the 20th century, and you can see where it is today, and you can measure that graph. And so we're between that. So there have been coastal metrics all up and down, but not as old as those. So we can anticipate as a result of that, those increases, but there will be small differences depending upon the coastal geology. How far out is the shallow area? In our case, it's impacted somewhat by Cape Canaveral. The Gulf Stream is closer to the shore in South Florida than it is here. So those cause certain differences. So it doesn't all rise equally.
Heidi Hirschberg.
So just quick follow-up. Clay, I know when I met you years ago, was down at the Southeast Compact meeting. And from that, we drew through the Volusia League of Cities, we ended up doing the Volusia Government's Water Resources Compact. And all 16 cities in the county signed on to that. And I think maybe what we need to look at is the next step to go ahead and look at some more data, bring that back up, and work together with the 16 cities in the county and see if we can have some sort of a sustainability plan and just get some numbers and take a look at like kind of what you said, Dwight, and see where we are. I think that's a good plan to look into. What do you think about that?
Well, and the other piece of this, and I know you and Pat and others, we've all tried, we've all had kumbaya moments where we've all tried to get everybody together. But the reality is we don't really need to get everybody together, but we do need to get the local governments in West Volusia working to figure out a solution for the springs and the St. Johns River. We do have example in Southeast Volusia where New Smyrna, Edgewater, and Oak Hill have worked on Indian River Lagoon issues. We used to have Halifax area cities working around the Halifax River. Interestingly enough, that came about because the medical association said don't go in the water anymore. Yeah. So we do need to find these opportunities for smaller groups to get together and work together. We don't need everybody in the room, but it would be nice to do that.
Your follow-up?
And just one quick question on talking about sustainability and poverty. When you look at a city like Deltona, when I talked earlier about the 3 pockets that were built in the 60s, those are the ones that had the original infrastructure with sewer and so forth. Well, as growth has occurred and sprawl has occurred, the larger houses and they spread out. And so what you have in those 3 pockets, you have the little 2-bedroom, 1 or 2 bath Mackle homes. Those are all on sanitary sewer. And because we have such a small amount of people on sewer, their bills are really high. And a lot of those are poverty level homes. And they're rentals. And so what you're doing is those people that can least afford it are having that just by virtue of the lack of infrastructure and the lack of diversifying our septic and water and how these people are doing that. So the poorest are a lot of times the hardest hit. So there has to be a way, and I don't think we're the only city. I mean, when you see a lot of the old portions of other cities, those houses are not built up and they lack standards that were put in place since Hurricane Andrew. So I think that as municipality leaders, we all need to look into that and see how it can be addressed in the future.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about elevation. Comment on any of this?
The poorest are often the hardest hit in a variety of areas. So even I think about in our county, the infrastructure in terms of public transportation. So those that can't afford a car or 2 cars per household to get around end up spending the majority of their time trying to get back and forth on our public transportation, which is it's not built well, and so we can extract that just from the sewer into a variety of areas.
Fred Costello.
We talk about sustainability, and I want to tie into something that Clay said when you talked about the aquifer and where you get your water. In Ormond Beach, we had the choice of continuing to get it out west where it was cheap, or St. John's came in and said, basically, in the future, you're going to have to use a low-pressure reverse osmosis, and so we went ahead and did it early. In other words, there's absolutely no shortage of water. There's just a shortage of cheap water. And so I want to compliment the local officials that are here. That's Dwight and Heidi. And if there's anybody else you too, because I believe the best government is the least government closest to the people. And the government closest to the people, the local government, needs to decide, are we going to have sanitary sewer in Deltona? I would say that the community, Volusia should not decide that. I don't think it's close enough to the first magnitude springs that we can tell them they should do it. I think it's up to them. But in Ormond Beach, I think they need to get rid of the septic tanks on the barrier island because it's impacting the river, just like what they're doing in southeast Volusia. So there are times that we as a county or a state need to weigh in on things, but otherwise leave it up to the locals and make sure we elect local officials who have the vision of the sustainability that we want for our community.
And we have time. You want to speak to that? We've got one question from a student. Please give us your name and what year of study you're in.
Hi, I'm Jessica Savage. It's my senior year in mechanical engineering here, and my senior design project is research on seawater desalination. So you mentioned like God's not making more fresh water, so that's what we're trying to do is take the ocean and make some more, and Florida's obviously surrounded by it. So I was curious, what are people higher up looking into to using the ocean as fresh water rather than just the ground?
And that's the subject tomorrow night at Dr. Jeff Kane's discussion about the water, and Nell, who's working with us tonight, is also on that project. Comments?
Well, we do have desal in Florida. There's in Tampa Bay, has been doing that for several years. Even in this county, we have a number of small mobile home projects, developments south of Edgewater that are on reverse osmosis. And then probably most famously, and for the longest, has been the Florida Keys, which has been producing fresh water from seawater for a long time. So we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more blending like the superficial aquifer issues here or out of the St. Johns River. We're going to see more blending of that. But it is about cost. And so it does cost more. And if we run out, we can make more, but it costs more.
Your question, sir.
I'm Sam Cromedy. I'd like to know what percentage of our sewage is converted to reuse water and what becomes of the sewage that is not used for reuse water.
That answer to that question varies from city to city. I can tell you in New Smyrna, it's 100% reuse, and not a drop has gone into the river in 5 years. That's not true for Daytona, obviously. Port Orange and Ormond Beach have been doing much, much better, but they're a majority now reuse, but not as far along as New Smyrna. In West Side, DeLand's doing pretty good. We at Stetson, for instance, we're 100% reuse. Every drop of water that goes to the plant comes back and is used for irrigation. So we're doing better, but we've still got a ways to go.
Our time is short. Before we leave tonight, we want to tell you about what we're going to be doing when we come back in 3 weeks. During Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we'll talk about cybersecurity and the election with Dr. Gary Kessler, Dr. Philip Krager, Steve DeVault, and Lisa Lewis, the election supervisor for Volusia County. But here, the general public is welcome, and we'll talk about how secure our election process is. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, an incredible panel. Dr. Jeff Brown, Dr. Taylor Mitchell, and Clay Henderson. A big round of applause. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. And thank you all for attending. Have a great night. We'll see you October 15th.